In 1986, Tom Hawks was a 39-year-old father of two teenage boys. He had previously been married to his boys' mother, but they had ultimately gotten a divorce. That year, Tom and his two sons were at this local chili cook-off in their neighborhood in Newport Beach, California, when Tom was looking out across the sea of people and he sees this stunningly beautiful woman he's never seen before, and he just finds himself staring at her. And he stares at her so long that this woman, she ends up noticing, and she looks up and kind of smiles and blushes and looks away, and Tom immediately is totally embarrassed because he just got caught staring at her, and so he decides, you know what, I gotta go over there and introduce myself. And so Tom, who's this totally ruggedly handsome, muscular guy with this incredible mustache, he strides across the lawn and he walks up to this woman and he introduces himself, and she is all smiles, and she says her name is Jackie and she's 29 years old and she's single. And from that point onward, those two completely hit it off. They fell madly in love. And just a few years later, in 1989, they got married in front of 150 of their closest friends and family. And then after the wedding, Jackie moved in with Tom and his two boys. And even though the boys' mother was still alive, they began calling Jackie Mom, because Jackie not only lived with them, but also because she was so devoted to them, and she just was such a loving and kind person that it just made sense to do that. Also, Jackie, when she was 22 years old, she had gotten into this horrific motorcycle accident, and the internal damage that accident had done to her had left her unable to have kids of her own, something she had always wanted to do. And so when she had the opportunity to be these boys' mother, she really leaned into it. And so she was like this fabulous mother. So over the years, Tom and Jackie raised their two sons, and then in 2002, when the boys were all grown up, they left the house. Now, this was a sad moment for Tom and Jackie to suddenly be empty nesters. I mean, so much of their identity was wrapped up in being parents, and they were very close with their sons. But at the same time, they knew this day was coming, and they had actually been preparing for it for several years. They had been putting money aside every single year to prepare for when their sons left, because they wanted to time it so they could retire at the same time. And their idea of retirement was to go buy a yacht and just live on the yacht and sail up and down the California and Mexican coastline. Now, neither Jackie nor Tom were wealthy at all. However, they were very good at saving money, and they were very disciplined, and they could live frugally. And so over the past couple of years, they really had saved virtually every penny so they could afford to buy this yacht. And so finally, in 2002, when their sons do actually leave, Tom and Jackie, they sell their house in Newport Beach, California. And between the proceeds from the sale of their house and all this money they had set aside, they had enough to purchase this kind of beat up, old, small yacht. And so this yacht they named the Well-Deserved. Even though this yacht was by no means a glamorous yacht like you think of when you hear that word, Tom and Jackie adored this boat. And so as soon as it was theirs and they had docked it in Newport, they moved all of their belongings onto this boat because they're going to live on this boat. And then they began meticulously cleaning it and organizing it and upgrading it everywhere they could within their limited budget. And by the summer of that year, this boat was beautiful, both on the outside and the inside. It was very cozy and very clearly had the touch of Tom and Jackie. It was a home. And so for the next 2 years, Tom and Jackie, they lived the dream. They took that yacht and just sailed up and down the coast of California and Mexico, and they would watch these beautiful sunsets, and they would catch fresh fish, and they would drink cocktails together. I mean, they were really enjoying their retirement. Then, in 2004, they got some unexpected news. One of their sons told them that he was now expecting to be a father. And so this baby was going to be the first grandchild of Tom and Jackie, and they were so excited. Especially Jackie, because remember, she wasn't able to have kids of her own, and she just loved the idea of getting to be motherly again, and the idea of getting to hold this precious little baby. And so even though Tom and Jackie were absolutely loving living out on this yacht, they decided that the time was right to actually sell the yacht and then take the proceeds from the sale of the yacht and buy a house on land to be closer to their son and this grandbaby. So in November of that year, the Hawks place an ad in this fishing magazine for the sale of their yacht. They were asking for about $500,000. And very quickly after this ad went live, this young couple who had saved up some cash, they offered to buy it. Tom and Jackie were totally thrilled, and they called their two sons to tell them the good news news that they had this buyer and that in the next couple of days the sale would be finalized and then they would be in touch. And so the sons, they're expecting to get a phone call from Tom and Jackie any day, but a couple of days goes by and they haven't heard from them. And so the sons begin calling their parents, and their parents aren't picking up their phone. Now, Tom and Jackie were not the type to go any amount of time without being in touch with their family. And so this was very uncharacteristic. And so when Tom's brother, Jim, who was a retired police chief, when he heard about this sudden silence, he just got in his car and drove to Newport Beach, California to see if maybe they had not finalized the sale of the yacht and maybe the couple was still on the yacht and he could go check in with them and make sure everything was okay. And so Jim, along with a friend of his, they arrive in Newport Beach, they make their way to the dock where the yacht was being held, and they go down to the floating section of the dock and they walk right up alongside the well-deserved, and just from where they're standing, it does not seem like anyone is on the yacht. However, as they're standing there just kind of looking at this yacht right in front of them, Jim notices a couple of oddities. He sees there are lines hanging over the side of the boat that should have been stowed. And Tom was known for being incredibly meticulous and orderly. I mean, that yacht was spick and span always. And so he would not have left these lines draped over the edge of the boat unless he was on board, and he wasn't. And so Jim's also looking around and he sees there are a couple of tarps that go over some of the control panels that had been taken off, but then not put back on the control panels. And so again, that's not something Tom or Jackie would have done. And then there's also some dirty towels kind of hanging out of one of the portholes. And so overall, the impression Jim and this friend got was, I guess they must have finalized the sale of this yacht, because clearly the new owners of this boat, they're the ones that are in possession of it, and they're the reason it's sloppy, because Tom and Jackie, they never would leave the boat in this condition. And so Jim pulls out his own business card and he writes a note on it that he's looking to speak with the new owners of this boat because his brother and his brother's wife had sold this boat to them, but now they're missing. And so please give me a call back. And so Jim and his friend, they leave the boat, they leave the dock, and they begin to leave the area when Jim's cell phone rings, and he picks it up, and it's this 21-year-old woman named Jennifer De Leon. And so she tells Jim that she got his business card on her yacht, and that yes, she and her husband had recently purchased this yacht from the Hawks, but like Jim, they were having a hard time getting in touch with the Hawks as well, because after acquiring their boat, Jennifer said she and her husband realized there were a couple of controls on the boat that they didn't know how to use, and so they needed to talk to Tom and Jackie to explain how to use them. Also, Jennifer said she had found some personal belongings that belonged to Tom and Jackie that were stuffed in a couple of drawers that just got left behind, and so she wanted to return that property to them as well. But she's telling Jim, I'm trying to get in touch with them and I can't get in touch with them. And so Jim asked Jennifer, when was the last time you or your husband saw Tom or Jackie? And she would say, the last time we saw them was when we actually finalized the sale of the boat, when we literally gave them the money and we watched them take the money, hop in their car, and drive away. Jim asked her if she had any idea where they might have been going, and Jennifer said, we really didn't have that many personal conversations with Tom or Jackie. It was mostly just business stuff. But in the limited personal interactions we did have, Tom would always talk about how he and Jackie planned on buying a house in Mexico in this town that bordered Arizona, because apparently they have a son that lives in Arizona and he's about to have a baby, and they were talking about how they wanted to be very close. Jim thanked Jennifer and asked her, if you hear from Tom or Jackie, please let me know. And then Jennifer says to Jim, same thing to you. If you hear from them, please let me know, because I need to talk to them too. And so they hang up, and Jim is left thinking, what's going on here? And then Jim remembers there's this woman that Tom and Jackie had hired. Her name was Patricia. And for the past couple of years that they had been out on their boat, they knew they would not have great internet. And so they would not be able to consistently be able to pay their bills and pay taxes. And so they had hired this woman, Patricia, who was also a friend of theirs, to basically pay their bills and manage their finances. And so Jim gets her number and he calls Patricia. And the first thing he asks her is, hey, have you spoken with Tom or Jackie recently? And she says, no, I haven't. And so Jim explains the situation and then asks Patricia, has Tom or Jackie recently made a large deposit into any of their accounts? Because just a couple of days ago, they would have received nearly $500,000. And so Patricia, she checks the accounts and she says, no, there's been no deposits made. And so Jim and Patricia are talking on the phone, trying to rationalize why Tom and Jackie would not have deposited so much money and they really couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation for it. And so after Jim hung up with Patricia, he just had a bad feeling about what was going on. And so Jim called the Newport Beach Police Department, and he officially reported Tom and Jackie missing. The first thing the Newport Beach Police Department did with this missing person report was to do some digging on the new buyers of this yacht, the De Leons. And when they looked at the 25-year-old husband named Skyler, they discovered he was a felon. He had been arrested and convicted of armed robbery and had spent some time in jail for it. And so naturally, the police were immediately suspicious of Skyler De Leon, and really the De Leons in general, because they were the last ones to see the Hawks before they went missing. And so they sent one of their detectives down to the dock to just kind of walk around the yacht and just kind of feel it out, see what's going on down there, see if there's anything unusual. And so this detective goes down to the dock, they walk onto the floating section of the dock, and they walk right up alongside the well-deserved. And from the looks of it, it doesn't appear that anybody's on board. And as this detective is kind of looking in the window and just kind of looking around, they think they see what looks like a bloody handprint inside the boat. And so that would end up being enough to get a search warrant. And before long that day, there were police swarming this boat, looking all over it. But it would turn out that was not a bloody handprint. It was actually just some rust. And there was nothing else of significance that was found on board this boat. And so the police are pretty frustrated because they really don't have any leads. And so they contact Skyler De Leon and they say, hey, you need to come into the police station and explain exactly what happened during your final interaction with the Hawks. And so Skyler comes to the police station, he's totally cooperative, and he explains to the detectives that, he saw this ad in this fishing magazine for a yacht. He contacted Tom Hawk and said, I'm interested. The two of them met up and then went out for a sea trial, which is basically a test drive, but for a boat. And during the sea trial, Skyler told Tom that he liked the boat and he wanted to go forward with the purchase. And so on November 15th, Skyler, along with his pregnant wife and his young daughter, and also a notary and another person, a friend of Skyler's that was there just kind of as a witness, they go to the parking lot of the dock right near where the yacht is. And then the Hawks show up, Tom and Jackie, and the De Leons literally hand over a suitcase full of cash to Tom, and then Tom and Jackie, with the notary, they signed the sale documentation, basically giving the boat over to the De Leons. And then Tom and Jackie took their suitcase full of cash, hopped in their SUV, and they drove off, presumably to go to Mexico. When the police asked Skyler, how were you able to afford such an expensive vessel? Skyler would tell them that back in the 1990s, he was actually a child star, or kind of. He was an extra on the very popular TV show Power Rangers, and from being on that show, he had made a bunch of money and he had set it aside. And as Skyler is telling the detectives this, he kind of just stops himself at some point and he's like, you know what? That's not really the truth. The reality is the reason we had the money to do this is not because of the cash I got from being a child star. It's actually because I stole the money. It would turn out that armed robbery that Skyler was convicted for and spent some time in jail for, that was because he was stealing money from this drug kingpin. And before he was arrested and sent off to jail, he had managed to take the money that he had stolen and hide it. And then after he had gone to jail and got out again, he came back to his hiding space and he just retrieved the money. But this money was stolen drug money, so it was hot. And so he needed to get rid of it. He needed to launder the money. And so that was why he was buying this yacht. He was going to buy it with this dirty money in bulk, in cash, and basically transform this hot, dirty money into this yacht. And then he was going to sell the yacht and get clean money for it. And so the police are totally shocked at this confession because Skyler has just completely incriminated himself in a money laundering scheme. But the police would ultimately say to Skyler, you know what? We're not going to charge you with money laundering because you're being so forthright and helpful with this investigation. And so they let Skyler go. The police would go on to interview Skyler's wife, Jennifer, as well as the notary and also that other friend who had come along for that final sale of the boat who was there as a witness. And so the police interview all three of those people and they asked them, what was your final interaction with Tom and Jackie like? And they all described the same situation of seeing Tom and Jackie taking the suitcase full of cash and then signing the paperwork, hopping in their car and driving off. The only detail that seemed to differ amongst these four people who were there was the way Tom and Jackie were acting. Skylar made it seem like Tom was kind of anxious and paranoid about having all this money, whereas the notary said, Tom and Jackie seemed completely normal to me. After all the interviews with these people who had seen Tom and Jackie last, the police felt like they had kind of reached a dead end and just didn't know what to do next. And so they went to the media and asked them to put out a bulletin that had a picture of Tom and Jackie, as well as a picture of their vehicle, and it asked people to come forward if they had seen them. And sure enough, within a couple of days of this bulletin going out on TV, this older couple in Mexico called the police to say the Hawks SUV is right across the street from me right now. It's parked right on the road. And so naturally, the Mexican authorities as well as American authorities, they rush to this location and they charge up to the house where this SUV is parked, and they're kind of expecting to find Jackie and Tom inside, or someone that at least knows Tom and Jackie. But when they knock on the door, this guy nobody recognized, someone who was living in Mexico, he comes up to the door and he's looking very confused, and the police ask him, whose SUV is that parked outside? And he said, oh, well, that's my friend's car. And they say, well, is your friend Tom or Jackie Hawks? And the guy's like, no, who's that? The car belongs to Skylar De Leon. This was, of course, the moment when the police realized Skylar was lying to them. He had told police the last time he had seen Jackie and Tom, they had hopped in their SUV and they had driven off. But clearly that was not the last time, because he somehow managed to acquire their car afterwards, and then he gave it to this random person in Mexico. So the police in Newport Beach, they used Skylar's money laundering confession on camera to bring him in. They arrested him on money laundering, and then with him in custody, they searched his home. And inside of his and Jennifer's house, they found all these things that belonged to the Hawks. Things like laptops and video cameras, things Tom and Jackie would not have left behind on the boat. But despite all this evidence connecting Skylar De Leon to the Hawks' disappearance, he maintained his innocence and said this was just a big misunderstanding. And then while he was in custody getting grilled by police, his wife, Jennifer, was also saying the same thing, that Skylar didn't do anything. She was even going on talk shows and talking about how this is just one big misunderstanding and Skylar had nothing to do with the Hawks' disappearance, that they are just as concerned about Tom and Jackie as everybody else is. But the police were not buying it. They knew Skylar knew something that he wasn't telling them, obviously. However, they weren't really getting anywhere interviewing Skylar. He was just kind of saying, look, I had nothing to do with it. And so the police decide, let's go back and re-interview the notary and also that other friend who was there as a witness on that day that the final sale of the boat took place. And so they call the notary back into the police department, and the notary is this woman named Kathleen Harris, who's never gotten in trouble in her life, and she's been a very successful notary for a long time. And so she sits down and they ask her again to describe her final interactions with Tom and Jackie. And once again, she says, yep, they came over, they signed the paperwork, they took their cash, they got in their SUV, and they drove off. But under follow-on, very intensive questioning by the police, Kathleen would finally break. And she would say, actually, I've never met Tom and Jackie in my entire life. I was paid up front in cash by Skylar De Leon to backdate those sale documents that had already been signed. I have no idea what happened to Tom and Jackie. Next, the police went out and got that friend who was also there at the time of the final sale, that witness. His name was Alonzo Mason. And so they bring him in and they ask him, what was your final interaction like with Tom and Jackie? And at first he stuck to the story that, they got the cash, they hopped in the SUV, they drove off, that's all it was. And the police stop him and they're like, we just spoke to the notary and she said she was lying. She wasn't even there. She had backdated those documents. So we know you're lying. And so as soon as Alonzo got caught red-handed, he began to clam up. And it was pretty obvious he did not want to say anything else. And since the police really needed something to happen with this case, they said to Alonzo, we will make sure your sentence is heavily reduced if you tell us everything you know about what happened to Tom and Jackie. And so Alonzo says, okay, I'll tell you. Alonzo was a young guy, very impressionable. He was in his early to mid 20s, and he was actually a jailer, and he had met Skylar when Skylar was in jail. He was in jail for that armed robbery. And so after Skylar gets out of jail, Alonzo and Skylar somehow stay friends, and they spend a lot of time together. And then in November of 2004, Skylar pulls Alonzo aside, and he confesses to him that he is in fact an international assassin, that people paid him to kill people, but only bad people, Skylar said. And he says to Alonzo, I have a current contract on two really bad people, Tom and Jackie Hawks, but I need help carrying this out. And so if you will help me carry out this contract, I will give you $1 million US. And so Alonzo's like, man, okay, yeah, I'll help you. And so on November 15th, Skylar, Alonzo, and a third man that Skylar had recruited to be a part of this job. He was this big, muscular, intimidating looking guy who was actually a longtime Southern California gang member. His name was John Kennedy. Those three, they show up at the parking lot of the dock not to finalize the sale of this yacht. They weren't even close to finalizing the sale. They were there to meet up with Tom and Jackie to do a sea trial, a test drive. But when Tom and Jackie arrive, Tom, who was a longtime probation officer and so was very used to being around felons and convicts, he immediately sized these three up and thought, bad news. And so when the two parties met each other in the parking lot, Skylar started to notice that Tom was definitely apprehensive about getting on a boat with them. In fact, Tom was talking about potentially rescheduling and that, today's not a good day. And Skylar's seeing, okay, they're clearly uneasy about getting on the boat with us. And so Skylar says, hey, Tom, Jackie, hold on a minute. I'm going to step aside and make a phone call. And so Skylar steps aside and he calls his wife, Jennifer, and she was not far away. And so just a couple of minutes later, Jennifer pulls into the parking lot carrying her little 1-year-old baby girl. And as soon as she walks over to this group, the dynamic completely changes. Jackie sees this baby and she immediately falls in love with it and she wants to hold the baby and she loves Jennifer. Jennifer is so sweet. And so Jackie seems very much at ease and Tom notices that. And so Tom begins to loosen up, and before long, Tom is saying to Skylar, you know what, guys? Today's fine. Let's do the sea trial. And so the group eventually begins to make their way onto the yacht, the well-deserved, to do the sea trial. And right as they're about to get on, Jennifer says, hey guys, I can't go on the sea trial. The baby's upset. I gotta go home. I'll see you guys when you get back. And at this point, Tom and Jackie, they've already committed to doing the sea trial. And so even if they were a little bit apprehensive going on this boat with just these three guys, they put their faith in the De Leons that this was on the up and up. So the two Hawks, along with these three men, they get on board the boat and they begin heading out towards open water. And so Tom was piloting the boat. And at some point when they were very far away from the dock and really any land in any direction, Skylar and John come up to Tom and they say, hey, we want to show you something down in the lower levels of the ship. And so Tom goes with them. They go downstairs into the bedroom. And while they're down there, Alonzo and Jackie were in the kitchen, which is right above the bedroom. And as they're standing there, Alonzo and Jackie suddenly hear this very loud commotion coming from the bedroom. Now, Alonzo knew what that was. It was Skylar and John attacking Tom. And so that was his cue. Alonzo leapt forward and he grabbed onto Jackie. And before Jackie could even figure out what was going on, he had thrown her to the ground, pulled her hands behind her back, and then he pulled out handcuffs that he had and he handcuffed her hands together.
Sounds like Jackie's here, Alonzo's here, and then that's where Thomas Hawks, Skylar, and JFK are on the bottom. And Jackie hears the commotion. She looks down this way, and this is where Alonzo overpowers her.
And as soon as Jackie was subdued in the kitchen, Skylar and John, they come up the stairs, and Tom's not with them, and they grab Jackie, and they walk her down into the bedroom, and Jackie would have seen her husband, Tom. He's been handcuffed, and he's laying on the bed on his back. And so they throw Jackie onto the bed right next to Tom, and immediately Jackie turns around and looks at Skylar and says, why are you doing this to us? We just met your wife. I just held your baby. Why are you doing this? All we want to do is just go back to land and be with our children and be with our grandchildren, please. But Skylar didn't care. He just turned to Alonzo and said, put tape on both of their mouths and their eyes. And as Alonzo was doing that, Skylar went upstairs and began piloting the boat towards the deepest part of the ocean. And so as Skylar is driving this boat, Alonzo and John are down in the bedroom, and Alonzo remembers looking over at Tom, and Tom was comforting Jackie. He had managed to pull his hand up, and he was stroking Jackie's hand, and he was saying to her, "It's going to be okay. No matter what happens to us, we'll be together." Suddenly, the boat stopped because Skylar had reached the deepest part of the ocean, and he called down to John and Alonzo to bring Jackie and Tom up onto the deck. And so Alonzo and John do just that. They march Tom and Jackie up the steps, they bring them out to the deck of the ship, and then Skylar forces them to sign the sale documentation for the boat, as well as had them sign additional paperwork that gave Skylar access to their bank accounts. And while they were signing these documents, Jackie actually misspelled her last name on one of the signature blocks. She left the S off of her last name. That's not something she would have done by accident. It's pretty clear she did that on purpose to signal to the future that she signed this under duress. After all these documents were signed, the three men led their two captives to the back of the boat. And then once they were standing at the back of the boat, Skylar tells Alonzo, in earshot of Jackie and Tom, to, hey, go to the front of the boat and get the anchor. And so Tom and Jackie, they know that whatever's going to happen to them next, it's not good. And so Jackie begins pleading with them to let them live, let them go back to land, let them see their grandchild. And Tom manages to shake his restraints from John, who was holding him, and he manages to kick Skylar really hard in the groin. But after that, John leapt on top of Tom and Jackie and subdued both of them. And then he positioned Tom and Jackie so they were sitting down back to back with their handcuffs connected to each other. And then Alonzo shows up dragging this heavy anchor, and he finally gets it all the way over until it's right next to Tom and Jackie, at which point Skylar grabs the long metal chain that came off of the anchor, and he felt around until he got to the very end of the chain. So not the side closest to the anchor that's attached to it, the far other side, the bitter end of this chain. And he reached down and he connected that portion of the chain to Tom and Jackie's handcuffs. And then once he was sure their handcuffs were securely fastened to the end of this chain, Skylar stood up, walked over and grabbed the anchor, and with quite a bit of effort, he managed to lift it up and threw it over the side of the boat. As soon as that anchor hit the water, all Tom and Jackie would have heard for several seconds would be the sound of all of that loose chain that they were connected to being rapidly pulled off the boat and being sucked down into the water. And so that chain was going up and over this wooden railing, and so all they would have heard is just chain links grinding over the railing until finally the anchor pulled the chain tight, at which point it yanked Tom and Jackie towards the side of the boat. Alonzo would say when this happened, Jackie's head struck the inside of the boat so hard it made this very loud, audible cracking sound. And then Skylar, Alonzo, and John just stood there as Tom and Jackie desperately tried to fight against the weight of this anchor that was trying to pull them off of the boat. Tom was trying to hold on to anything he could to try to hold his wife in place, but eventually the weight of this anchor combined with the movement of the boat was just too much. And so Tom and Jackie were very slowly pulled up and over and off the boat into the water. When they hit the water, they would have been fully alive, fully conscious, as they began their rapid descent to the bottom of the ocean, 3,500 feet below. Alonzo would tell police as soon as Tom and Jackie disappeared below the surface, Skylar let out a woohoo and ran over to the edge of the boat and looked into the water like a giddy child. And he was staring at where they had disappeared, and he was just grinning and laughing. And then finally, when the water went calm and there were no more bubbles, Skylar just kind of laughed, turned around, and made his way back to the cockpit and began piloting the boat back towards the dock. Even though Jennifer was not on the boat at the time of the murder, she was equally involved in it. In fact, the attack was her idea. She wanted more money, and she saw this scheme as being a way of doing that. So remember, when she showed up at the dock parking lot with her baby and put Jackie and Tom at ease to help get them out on that sea trial, she was doing that very very intentionally to trap Jackie and Tom. She knew what was going to happen out on that boat. She was trying to get them to go so they could be murdered and they could steal their boat. And when Skylar was out on the boat, before, during, and after the murders, he would step aside and call Jennifer to let her know how it was going and kind of get her feedback and ask for advice about what they should do next. With that in mind, one of the darker elements of this case has to do with the video camera that was discovered inside of Jennifer and Skylar's house. It was the Hawks video camera, and they had used it over the past couple of years to document their travels out on the ocean. And so when the police acquired this video camera, they played the tape that was inside of it. And at first, the tape shows Jackie filming the inside of the well-deserved yacht, and she's talking about how sad it was that this is probably one of the last times they'll be inside of this boat. But she and Tom are so happy because they've found buyers who are going to take great care of this boat, and they're excited about the future, they're excited about their grandchild. And then suddenly, this footage of Jackie inside of the boat just totally cuts, and it jumps to Skylar and Jennifer at Thanksgiving dinner that year, playing with their daughter and just having this great time, meaning just days after Jennifer and Skylar murdered Tom and Jackie in the worst way imaginable, they took their camera and just began using it for their own lives, recording their own life over the memories of Tom and Jackie. Jennifer and Skylar truly didn't care at all about what they had just done. Alonzo would ultimately be sentenced to 20 years in prison. He would have gotten a much more severe sentence, but because he provided all of the details of what happened and he was promised a reduction in sentence, he was only given 20 years. Jennifer would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and John Kennedy and Skylar were sentenced to death. One night in the summer of 1921, a young man named Carl Logies walked across the farm that he had recently purchased in rural Ohio. He was on his way to check on his horses and his cattle one last time before he went to bed. He had a gun on his hip and a lantern in the other hand, and as he walked across the farm, he sort of looked out at the farmhouse and the barn up ahead and the water well and all this land, and he couldn't help but feel really proud of what he had. I mean, this was all his. So Carl had always dreamed of having this, of having his own farm. And he'd been able to get this one for a really low price because apparently the people who owned it before him had been very eager to get rid of it. And he had seen it as a great opportunity. Now, Carl didn't really know why they wanted to move it so badly, but he didn't care. It just meant he got a great deal. And so Carl continued walking over to the barn where his cattle and his horses were. And as he got closer, keep in mind it's dark out, it's late at night, he suddenly felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, and he had this unmistakable feeling that he was being watched. But Carl, he lives alone. It's just him and his animals. Like, there's no reason there would be anybody nearby to watch him. And so instinctively, Carl stops where he is and he whips around and he shines his lantern in all directions, just seeing if there's somebody there, but there's nobody. Granted, his field of vision is pretty limited. I mean, it's dark outside, his lantern's not that bright, but for the most part, he can tell that there's no one in the immediate vicinity. He's all alone. So then his thought is, well, is there a predator nearby? I mean, is there an animal watching me? But Carl, he's looking around and it's a peaceful, quiet night, and the previous owners certainly hadn't mentioned any risk of predators in the area. And so Carl tells himself, he's just being paranoid. He's new to this property. He doesn't really know what it's like to be here. And so he tells himself, you're just overthinking it. Go to the barn, take care of your animals, and just go to bed. Everything is fine. And so Carl turns around and he walks over to the barn. He goes inside and he kind of busies himself getting the horses and the cattle ready for the night. And, he's in there for a few minutes. And for the most part, he's forgotten about that strange feeling he had when he came over, that feeling of being watched. But after he was wrapping up, he couldn't help but start to feel like he had that feeling again, that there was somebody watching him. And so he's looking out his barn door and he doesn't see anything, but it's dark out there, and he's kind of looking around the inside of his barn. And again, he's telling himself that you're being paranoid, everything is fine. But admittedly, deep down, Carl was feeling pretty nervous about just this walk he was going to have to make through the darkness across his property back over to the farmhouse. But, he steeled his resolve. He grabbed his lantern and he checked his gun on his hip. And then he walked out the doors of his barn and began quickly making his way towards his house. And as he's walking, he's kind of scanning both sides, checking to make sure nobody's out here, and he's not seeing anyone. And right as he's about halfway to his house, something catches his eye on the far side of the property, something kind of off in the distance. And he stops and he aims his lantern in that direction, which doesn't really illuminate that much, but it illuminates enough to see that there's actually somebody standing on his property. And he's so alarmed by it, he just stands there holding his lantern, looking at this person, and it's like this white silhouette just standing there still, looking right over at Carl. They're sort of in the vicinity of his water well. And after being frozen for a second, Carl kind of snapped out of it and he said, "Hey, who are you? What are you doing here?" And this figure doesn't move, doesn't react. They just stand there kind of staring at Carl, and then they turn and begin kind of moving away from Carl in the direction of the water well. And Carl, at this point, he doesn't know what's happening. He thinks that this person clearly is some sort of trespasser. They must have been here earlier. That's what I was feeling. They were here. They've been watching me. Are they going to try to rob me? Who is this? And so he draws his gun and he starts chasing after this person. And as he's running, his lantern's waving back and forth. And as he's running, he loses sight of this white figure. And by the time he actually gets to the water well, he realizes he's lost this person. They're just gone. At this point, Carl really didn't know what to make of this. He didn't know where this person went. He has no idea if they've doubled back around and they're going to try to go in his house at some point here. He does not understand what's happened or where they've gone. He doesn't know who they are. And so all he can think to do as he's standing there by the well, out of breath, from running there, is just to yell out that, he's got a gun and he's not afraid to use it. And don't you dare come back here. But despite yelling out these sort of open-ended threats into the darkness, there's no response. And he doesn't see this white figure anywhere. It's just dark and silent in all directions. And so for a while, Carl just stood there at the well, just, looking out, almost expecting to see this figure reappear, but they never did. And eventually, when it really felt like everything had kind of calmed down on his property, he just turned and run the rest of the way over to his farmhouse. He went inside and locked the door behind him. Now, the next morning when Carl woke up, he tried to tell himself that whatever happened the night before, it had to be an anomaly. Maybe that was a neighbor who had come over and they were shy, or maybe it was, a potential trespasser or a thief or something, and they were scared off by Carl's threats of being willing to use his weapon. Carl is telling himself that whatever that was last night, he likely would never encounter that person ever again, and, it was handled. But Carl was wrong. Almost every single night from that night onward for the next year, at about 9:30 p.m. every night around the time that Carl would go to the barn to check on his animals before bed, he would always see that figure. And they were never close enough that Carl could actually see who it was or get any sense of what they wanted. They were always just kind of off on the side of the property, always watching Carl every time he came out of the barn. And then when he would invariably scream at them and run towards them, and even at one point he fired his weapon in their direction, every time this figure would just, without saying anything, move away from Carl in the direction of the water well. And around there, Carl would lose sight of them. They would just vanish. Now, as much as Carl really wanted to pretend that this was just something explainable, that this was some person coming on his property that was evading his capture every single night, as much as he wished that could be the explanation, Carl knew, despite not being a very superstitious or, a believer in the paranormal, despite not being those things, he felt like what he was witnessing was a ghost. I mean, what else could it be? It's this white figure that floats away from him and vanishes every night. That's a ghost. And also, another part of Carl was thinking, the previous owners were really excited to sell this property effectively at a loss. It's like they just wanted to be rid of this property. And he couldn't help but feel like maybe there's a connection between what I'm seeing and why they left. But the one thing that Carl hung on to was that despite how unsettling this whole thing was and how terrifying it was to, see this figure floating around on his property, despite that, the reality is it was pretty predictable. Every night around 9:30, he would see this ghost, whatever it was, but it didn't really affect him or his animals. It was just terrifying. And he accepted that. It just sort of became his new normal. That is, until August 1st of 1922, which happened to be almost exactly a year after Carl had purchased this property. On that day, Carl noticed his horses, his cattle, they stopped drinking the water, the well water that he gave them all year long since he had been here. They had never had any issues with it, but on that day, they just stopped drinking it. And in fact, they were kind of skittish around the water, like there was something in the water that was upsetting them. Carl tasted the water, it tasted fine to him, but he assumed there just must be something in it that made it unclean to the animals. And so what he had to do was clean the water, which meant he needed to drain the well, get rid of all this dirty water, and let the well refill, and hopefully at that point it will be clean. So Carl goes over to the water well. Remember, this is always where the figure goes off and disappears to. And as the water began to drain, he realized there was something in the well, clearly deep in the well that he never would have been able to see unless he drained it. And here he is draining it, and he's looking down and he can't quite tell what it is, but eventually the water was shallow enough that it was obvious what was in the bottom of his well. And at that point, he went and got the sheriff. It would turn out 5 years earlier, Carl's farm had been owned by another man whose name was Frank Lerman. And Frank, when he was here, had multiple employees, including a young farmhand named Henry Lipenstick. And one day, Henry had gone missing. Henry didn't have any family or close friends who lived nearby, and so basically everybody in town assumed that Henry must have just left town. But one of Frank's neighbors had told the sheriff at the time that she didn't actually believe that. She thought maybe Frank himself had done something to Henry. Because according to her, Frank and Henry argued all the time about money. Like there was clearly real tension between those two. The sheriff tried to look into Frank to see if there was any legitimacy to this claim. But at the same time this investigation was beginning, Frank abruptly sold his property and moved away. And without any real evidence, the sheriff couldn't prove there was any foul play involved. And so he just had to close the case and move on. Until Carl, 5 years later, drained that well. And suddenly, the Henry Lipenstick case was solved. Because at the bottom of the well, Carl found Henry's very decomposed body. He was practically skeletal by this point, but they could tell that was Henry. An autopsy later revealed that Henry had died of blunt force trauma to the head, and his death was ruled a homicide. Frank was arrested and found guilty of second-degree murder, but he only served 7 months before his charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence, and he was released. When they pulled Henry's remains out of the well to give him a proper burial, they noticed he was wearing a watch, and the watch had stopped at 9:35 p.m., precisely the time that Carl, for a whole year, saw that white figure running off, disappearing over towards the water well where Henry's body was located. After Henry's body was properly buried, Carl never saw that white figure ever again. Also, it's believed that the previous owners right before Carl, who sold him the property at a discount, likely they were selling it because they too had seen Henry's ghost. Happy New Year, everybody! And to celebrate this new year, I actually have a pretty huge announcement. So beginning this Monday and going forward, we're going old school on this channel. We're going back to 2, 3, even 4 uploads a week. And this is none of that oh, we edited it differently so it's brand new. No, we're talking new content up to 4 times a week. So how will it actually work? Well, this week, you're going to be getting new stories on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and of course Saturday. Saturday is the same as it's always been and will continue to be. And then each and every week after that, you're going to be getting 2, 3, even 4 brand new Mr. Ballen episodes every single week. You've told me that you want more strange, dark, and mysterious stories, and now you're going to get it. Can't wait to see you guys. Thank you. Late one night in the winter of 1933, a young nobleman named Anton Holberg poured another round of drinks for all of his buddies who were sitting inside of one of Anton's many sitting rooms inside of his huge castle that he owned in southern Poland. And after pouring these drinks, Anton kind of clumsily began walking his way over to the table where his buddies were, and because Anton was pretty drunk, because he and his friends had been drinking for hours and playing cards and partying, Anton stumbled at some point and basically spilled half of the drinks onto the carpet. But because he was so drunk, he just thought it was really funny. and so did his friends. They were all roaring with laughter as he's on the carpet, picking up all these basically empty glasses. But then instead of going back and re-pouring the drinks, Anton, sort of as a joke, walked over to the table, sat down, and handed out these basically empty cups to his friends. And everybody thought it was so funny, and they didn't even get up to get more drinks. They were just all so drunk and happy, they just kept on playing their card game. And so as Anton's sitting there and everyone's laughing and smiling, the friend of his that was the dealer for this round of blackjack began to deal. But as he did, there was this sudden, really loud creaking sound that came from right above them. And it was so loud and so pronounced that even amongst this loud room of drunk men playing cards, everybody heard it. And there was a moment of silence where everyone sort of registered, like, what's going on above us? And in this sudden stillness, Anton, he sort of made a jest and he goes, oh boy, that's the monk. Now, for the most part, everybody at the table, all of Anton's friends that were there, they had heard the story of the so-called hooded monk that apparently haunted the castle. That's at least what Anton would say. But one person who was there that night was a new friend of Anton's, and they had not heard of, the monk story. And they said, well, what are you talking about? That's the monk. And immediately everyone's like, oh, geez, here we go. Because Anton, he looked over at the friends and he was like, oh, you haven't heard the story of the hooded monk? Let me tell you. And then Anton basically told this friend, as the rest of the friends are all like, give me a break, this is just crap, this is not real. But Anton would tell this person, this newbie, that when he took ownership of this huge castle, he was told that everything's fine, except there's one bedroom upstairs that's totally off limits, because apparently it is haunted by a hooded monk, an evil hooded monk that sort of patrols this room. And Anton told this friend that he actually had never gone in that bedroom because he believed the story was true, that maybe, just maybe, there really was a malevolent spirit, a hooded monk figure that was in there. And also, he had tons of bedrooms in his castle. He didn't need to go in there, but, right above us is that off-limits bedroom, and so maybe that creak we heard was the monk. Now, again, basically everybody in the room knew this story, because Anton loved to tell the story of how his castle was haunted. But that's all it ever was. It was just some story that Anton told. But this friend, when they heard this from Anton, their reaction was, wait a minute, you have a bedroom in this castle that you own that you literally haven't gone inside of because there's a ghost in there? Are you kidding me? You literally haven't gone in that room for that reason? And as they said it out loud, all of Anton's other friends sort of picked up on how cowardly it seemed for Anton to have never gone in. Suddenly this story just made it seem like Anton was just kind of a coward. And everybody just piled on. They're like, yeah, Anton, why haven't you gone in there? Come on, man, this is your castle. Go in that bedroom. And before long, Anton was no longer happy to be talking about the story. He was like, oh yeah, just forget about it, guys. Let's get back to our game. But nobody would let it go until finally they dared him, like, hey, not only should you go in there, but tonight, you should stay the night in that bedroom to show us that you're really not afraid. And eventually, because Anton was so drunk and he was sort of standing up for his pride, he finally said, fine, fine. I'll go in there and I'll spend the night. Fine, I'll show you that this is just a story, it's no big deal. Now, after Anton loosely agreed to this, he likely thought that, the guys will forget about this and we'll go back to playing cards, and by the end of the night, nobody's gonna make sure I really go into that bedroom tonight. They're gonna forget about this. But no, the friends would not let this go. And at the end of the night, when they had kind of wound down their card game and everybody was feeling pretty tired, they all were like, okay, Anton, we're gonna walk you up to your bedroom to make sure you sleep inside of that haunted room. And because Anton had already publicly declared that he wasn't afraid and he would do it, he was like, okay, let's go. And so the group, with Anton in the lead, they left the sitting room and they went up the stairs to the second floor, and they go down the hallway to the bedroom where supposedly, this hooded monk ghost resided. And the door, it wasn't barred up or anything, but again, Anton had never been in there, but he had grabbed the key. And Anton, he goes up and he sort of nervously unlocks the door, and then before pushing it open, he turns and looks at his friends and he's like, all right, I'm going in, trying to see if they really wanted him to do it. And all his friends are sort of looking at him sort of hesitantly, but they're like, yeah, go inside, go, do it. And Anton's like, all right, He pushes the door open, and he and his friends, they all look inside. For the first time, Anton is now laying eyes on the inside of this bedroom. And really, there was not much to see. I mean, it was a bedroom, and there was old furniture in there that looked like it had been there for hundreds of years, covered in dust, and there's cobwebs everywhere, but it basically just looked like a really old bedroom that nobody used. And so his friends are like, all right, Anton, get in there. And Anton's like, all right, I'll see you in the morning. And he goes inside the room, and he shuts the door, and then the friends, they all walked back down the hall, went into their respective bedrooms where they were sleeping, and everybody went to bed. Several hours later, in the middle of the night, as all the friends are all asleep, there's this sudden, extremely loud, blood-curdling scream that appeared to be coming from the bedroom where Anton was, inside the haunted room. And so the friends, they jump out of bed, they run into the hallway, they go down the hall, and they get to the door and they try to open it, the room that Anton's in, but it's locked. And they start banging on the door, yelling, Anton, are you okay? Are you okay? Because even though they had put him up to this, they had dared him to do this, they didn't really think there was any risk, but at the same time, maybe there was something bad in there, so they're worried. They're worried about Anton. They want to make sure he's okay. But after pounding and yelling on the door, there was no response. The haunted bedroom where Anton was completely silent. And the friends, they all kind of exchanged worried glances, and they're like, we got to get in there. We got to make sure he's okay. Something just feels wrong. That scream, that's somebody in danger. Like Anton could be hurt here. And so they began smashing this door, ramming into it, until finally they literally blew the door off its hinges. And when they looked into the room and saw what was going on, they couldn't believe it. When Anton went into the bedroom to spend the night, his friends would recall hearing the sound of him turning the key and locking the bedroom door behind him. So Anton is in this haunted bedroom and he's locked inside, and there's no other way in or out of this bedroom. So he is in there totally alone and he's locked the door. So keep that in mind. So now, a few hours later, after hearing the scream, the friends blow the door open, literally knock it off its hinges because it was locked, and they find Anton. And he's dead. And he's laying on the bed on his back, and the only sign of something that happened to him is there's this red mark around his neck, like a ligature mark, a thin red ligature mark around his neck. But there's no rope or line anywhere in the room. There's no sign of a struggle. There's nothing else really in this room except for Anton. And he's just inexplicably dead with this mark on his neck. Authorities got involved and they searched the room top to bottom, and they never found any rope or any line, nothing that could have left those marks on his neck. And they also did an autopsy on Anton, but they couldn't figure out what his cause of death was. So just the fact that Anton died in this really inexplicable way in a bedroom that he claimed was haunted is pretty mysterious. But it becomes even more mysterious when you consider the whole story about this ghost that haunted this castle. So Anton, when he would typically tell the story, would just basically say, well, there's this evil hooded monk that is upstairs in one of the bedrooms, and that's why I don't go in it. And that's kind of the whole story. But that's not the whole story. That's just kind of the version that Anton would tell. The whole story was, this castle has been haunted for hundreds of years. There is an evil monk that lives in that bedroom upstairs, and if you go in there, the evil monk will kill you by strangling you with a thin rope. That's the story. And so it really makes you wonder, because to this day, nobody knows how Anton Holberg died alone in that locked bedroom after seemingly being strangled by a rope that didn't exist. Around 1 a.m. on Sunday, January 20th, 1907, a 57-year-old man named Samuel Hughes was riding on a passenger train that was moving through southeastern Wales. Sam had spent basically the last 24 hours working the entire time. He was a salt merchant, and he had left the town where he lived, a town called Blackwood, and taken a train south about an hour to another town called Newport, where he did a lot of business. And basically all day Saturday, from early morning all the way until late at night, he had been working. And now finally, 1 a.m. on Sunday, he's back on a train heading back to his town in Blackwood. But despite how utterly exhausted he was on this ride back home, barely able to keep his eyes open, Sam was just so relieved that soon, very soon, he would get off the train, he'd be back in his house, and he could just collapse in bed. And so that's all he's thinking about. And so for a little bit longer, Sam is, fighting to keep his eyes open, and the train's rumbling along, and he can tell he's getting close to home. I mean, he rides this train all the time. This is a pretty, regular route for him. And then finally, Sam feels the train start to slow down, at which point he gathers up all his things. He gets up and kind of shuffles his way into the hall. And then once the train came to a full stop, he stepped off the train onto the platform, relieved that, he's now maybe 10 minutes from home. But as the train took off from the station, Sam, who's again standing on this platform, it's late at night here, he's looking around and he realizes something. In his stupor, in his exhaustion, he didn't realize this was not his stop. He had gotten off one stop too early. It was like he was on autopilot. He was so tired, he got off thinking he was home, but he wasn't. And now the train is gone. And remember, this is the early 1900s. He didn't have a quick way to get from where he was to his home. Like, there wasn't going to be another train anytime soon, nor did he know the train schedule. He also didn't have a way to call a cab or anything. It's 1, 2 in the morning here. And so Sam realizes he basically can either find a place to stay in whatever town this is, or he can basically walk to Blackwood, which is, a pretty good walk away, but he figured, maybe, this town was close enough he could do it. And so he figured, his first step here is just leave the platform and just go find anybody in town that maybe is out and about, and just kind of figure out where we are. How do I get to Blackwood? Is there a hotel nearby or an inn or something? But he needs to go find somebody. And so even though Sam at this point is furious with himself and really just wants to spend time dwelling on the fact that he's made this mistake, he's sort of over that, and he's just focused on finding a solution. And so Sam leaves the platform and he starts walking, in the general direction of lights that he sees off in the distance. But this is a small train platform. He's clearly not near any major city. It's pretty much dark and just rural roads going in different directions. And so he really does not have high hopes that he's going to run into anybody anytime soon. But surprisingly, after leaving the platform and walking not very far, he got to an intersection where he saw another person walking up the other street. And he quickly realized it was a police officer. And so Sam is so relieved, an authority figure, they can help me. And he flags down the police officer, and the officer comes over, and they're kind of sizing up Sam, like, what are you doing out here? It's the middle of the night. You got luggage with you. Like, what's going on here? And Sam explained the mistake he had made and asked the officer, like, hey, is there a place to stay here? Or maybe, is it walkable to get to my town, Blackwood? And the officer would tell him, like, there is places to stay in this town, but if you're up for it, it would only take you, maybe an hour if you did want to make the walk to Blackwood. And, if I was in your shoes, I might do that. And Sam, he thought about it and he was like, you know what? I do. I just want to get home. I want to get in my own bed. So yes, just point me in the right direction. And so the officer, he explained to Sam that luckily it's really simple. You just basically go straight down that road and you walk for about an hour until you reach a bridge. Once you get over the bridge, follow some signs, and it'll be really obvious that you're right near Blackwood, and you'll make it the rest of the way. And so Sam thanked the officer and then gathered up his things, and he began walking in the direction of his town. Several hours later, a little after 3 a.m., Sam's wife, Bess, was awake inside of their home in Blackwood. She was awake because she was waiting for Sam to get home. She knew he would have a long day in Newport, but by now she knew he should be home. I mean, he went on this trip fairly regularly. She knew how long it took, even on the long end. And it being 3 a.m. and him not being home was starting to be pretty concerning. And so she's up, she's kind of anxious, and all of a sudden, she hears Sam calling out to her. He's clearly out in front of the property. He must have known that she was awake. He could see the lights on inside the house, and he was calling out to her that, he was returning. And so Bess, she's overcome with relief. She knows her husband is safe. She grabs a candle and she goes to the front door to greet her husband. She opens the door and she looks out, and it's not her husband. Her husband is nowhere to be found. Instead, there is this dark figure standing on her porch, just inches away, looking right at Bess. And Bess, she freezes when she sees it, but she isn't scared. There's a weird calm about what she's looking at. She doesn't know what it is. She has no idea what to do, but she's just standing there calm as this figure is right in front of her, not moving. And as she's just staring at it, she realizes it's dressed in this long black cloak, and it had on a black silk hat. And her husband always wore
a black silk hat. And she knew specifically he had worn it that morning when he went to Newport. And so for a minute, she's just staring sort of unbelievably at this apparition, apparently wearing clothes, at least a hat, that belonged to her husband. And she knows she just heard her husband call to her. She didn't imagine that. He just called to her. But then Bess blinked, and the figure just vanished. The hat, the cloak, it's all just gone. And there's nobody standing on her porch. And now Bess is scared, because as much as there was a calm about this figure, now she's thinking, like, did I just imagine that? Like, what's going on here? Is my husband outside somewhere? Did he call to me because he's hurt or something? And so she leaves her house with this candle, and she's running around her house calling out for Sam, but Sam's not out there. And so eventually Bess goes back inside the house and just continues to sit up waiting for Sam. But Sam doesn't come home. And eventually, by 5 or 6 in the morning, Bess just goes to bed. When Bess woke up later that afternoon, Sam still had not come home yet. But now, the sun is out, and she's telling herself that weird thing that happened last night, she must have imagined that, like, that didn't happen. And, Sam's fine. He'll be home. He's stayed late before and not told me, like, everything's okay. But as Bess is reassuring herself that everything's okay, she hears a knock on the front door. And for a second, she thinks maybe it's Sam, maybe he's home. But she goes to the door, she opens it up, and it's a police officer. And he just says to her, I have some terrible news. It would turn out the night before, when Sam met that police officer who told him to walk this way to get back to Blackwood, well, Sam had followed the directions, and apparently he was on the right path because he got all the way to that bridge that the officer said would, demarcate that he was close to Blackwood. But perhaps because he was so exhausted, or maybe just because it was still so dark outside, he fell off the bridge to his death. And so the police officer is telling Bess this, and she's totally overcome with grief. But then for whatever reason, her mind immediately went to that dark figure she saw on the porch a little after 3 a.m. And without really thinking this through, she just said to the officer, what time do you think he died? And the officer was like, well, based on the officer that directed Samuel in that direction, towards the bridge and how long it would have taken him to get there, we estimate he likely fell off the bridge around 3 in the morning. And so for Bess, she's thinking, that's around the same time I saw that figure on my porch. And then she also began to think about that hat, the black silk hat that Sam always wore, that she knew he had worn that morning when he went to Newport. And so Bess's next question was, well, when you found him, was he wearing his black silk hat? And the officer was kind of confused and said, no, he wasn't wearing a hat at all. And so when Bess heard that, those details confirmed that who or what she saw on her porch earlier that morning, the dark figure with the black silk hat, that must have been Sam's soul. He was coming to say goodbye to his wife because he had just fallen off the bridge and died. And, this figure having that black silk hat on was a way of showing her that, yes, that really was her husband. Bess would later tell this story to a reporter who would have this story printed all over Wales, and that's how we know it today.
Located in the far northwestern section of Canada is the aptly named Northwest Territories. It is a massive swath of land that virtually nobody lives inside of. To make that point crystal clear, consider the following. The country of Germany has a population of 83 million people, give or take. The Northwest Territories is 4 times as large as Germany, but only has a population of about 50,000 people. In addition to being this huge and mostly unoccupied space, the Northwest Territories are almost completely wild. Think dense forests, huge mountains, massive rivers and lakes, and lots of really big animals. Even for highly experienced outdoors men and women, the Northwest Territories can be a truly hazardous place. And within this truly hazardous place, there is one part that is the most hazardous, and it's right in the middle of the Northwest Territories. And it's this 11,000 square mile stretch of just pure wilderness that's called the Nahanni Valley. In 1976, the Nahanni Valley was made into a national park. But don't let that fool you. This is not some family park that anybody can go to. There are no tourist accommodations, so there's no hotels, there's really nothing inside of it. And there are no roads that lead into this park. The only way you can get inside this valley is by plane or by boat or by very stressful and difficult overland hike. But for those who are able and willing to make the effort to get inside of this valley, you have the opportunity to explore one of the most beautiful places on the planet, because this section of the world is almost completely untouched by man. It is really nature at its purest form. However, there is a catch. This valley is said to be haunted. Over the last 10,000 years, the handful of native tribes that have attempted to settle inside of the Nahanni Valley have all either suddenly disappeared without a trace, like the Naha tribe that literally overnight just was gone, leaving behind their shelters, their food, their supplies, just gone. No one knows what happened to them. Or the tribes have abruptly fled, claiming they were being terrorized or stalked by creatures lurking in the forest, like these white demons and these large wolves they called wahilas. Now, of course, this just sounds like folklore, and it might very well be that that's all it is, folklore. But starting in the early 1900s, some very strange things started happening in the Nahanni Valley that were not folklore. These things happened, and they were horrifying. These were horrifying real events. And they might, depending on your viewpoint, give credit to some of the theories that the native tribes people have about this valley, which is there's something evil lurking out in this forest, but we just don't know what it is. In 1904, three brothers, Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod, who all lived in the Northwest Territories, decided they wanted to go looking for gold in the Nahanni Valley. They figured because so few people had ever been inside of this valley, that if there was gold to be found, then certainly it had not been found yet. And so after a very long and arduous journey using sled dogs and trains and homemade boats, they finally slipped into the valley and found themselves on what's called the Flat River, which runs right through the center of the Nahanni Valley. Now, the Flat River is kind of ironically named because it's anything but flat. It's actually more like a rapid at certain points. But either way, the three brothers, they're on their boat, they're making their way up the Flat River, and at some point they pull off onto the riverbank and they set up camp. And then once their camp is set up, they go down to the river and they put their gold sluices in the water. A gold sluice is this long, skinny box that's usually made of wood, and it has a strainer on one side. And gold miners will put it in the water submerged, and they will kind of shovel the sediment on the bottom of the water into this little funnel, and the big stuff will get stopped by the strainer, and the dirt and the water will just kind of flow out the side. And so the idea is you can trap gold nuggets inside of this sluice. And so the three brothers, they get their sluices up and they start looking for gold, and right away they hit pay dirt. There is tons of gold in this river. And so all day, all night, they get all this gold. The next morning they do the same thing, and by the time all their containers are literally filled to the brim with gold, they decide, hey, let's go back and turn this in, get some money for it, and then come back out here. And so they pack up their tent, they pack up all their supplies, and they put everything back in their boat. They get out onto Flat River, and at some point, very early on in their journey back, the boat capsizes, and the boat actually breaks apart from the strength of the rapids of Flat River. And so the boat actually just sinks, and much of their supplies sink, including all of their gold. But the three brothers are able to grab some of their supplies, like their rifle and some lumber and some of their mining supplies, and they swim it all to shore. They catch their breath. They're totally devastated at the loss of the gold, but they're alive. They have enough supplies to survive. And so they figure all they can do is maybe try to go back to their original site, try to get some more gold because they did still have a sluice, and then try to get out of there and then, regroup and come back another time. And so using some of the lumber they recovered from their broken boat, and then also by cutting down some trees, they literally fashioned another boat and then hopped back on the Flat River, and they went back up to that site where they had found gold earlier. They set up their sluice, they set up their camp again, and this time they didn't find any gold. So all day, this very disappointing day that they've already lost all their gold, now they're not finding any more gold. And so that night when they went to bed, they decided that the next day they were just going to leave. And so the next day they get up, they pack up, they hop back on the Flat River on this new boat they built, and they're able to make their way out of the valley and get back to their homes. As soon as they get back home, the two younger brothers, Willie and Frank, start talking about how they want to go back into Nahanni Valley and go get more gold, because now they know there's gold out there. It's not a question, yeah, we didn't find it that second time, but we know it's out there. Charlie, the older brother, he wanted to get the gold, but he felt like, hey, that was a close call with the boat flipping over. I don't know if it's a good idea, so I'm actually not going to go. You guys can go, I'm going to stay. And so several months goes by, and Frank and Willie have been doing all this preparation for this additional trip into the valley. And finally, in 1905, they're ready. And so Willie, Frank, and a third man called Robert Weir, who was a friend of theirs, he was going to replace Charlie. The three of them, they make their way up into the valley. Now, they didn't tell anyone how long they were going to be gone for, and so when they didn't send any word and no one had heard from them in weeks, Charlie was actually not that concerned because he knew there was lots of gold to be had out in the Nahanni Valley, and so he figured they must have struck it rich, and now they've decided to live out there long term, or at least maybe through the summer, or maybe the next year, and so he wasn't concerned, and because he wasn't concerned, nobody else was concerned about these three men. And so weeks turned into months, turned into a year, and still no one's heard from these three men. No one's heard from Willie, Frank, or from Robert, but still Charlie maintains that nothing can be wrong because there's three of them out there. They're incredibly experienced. There is a ton of gold out there. I'm sure they're just killing it and they're just acquiring all this gold, and we're going to see them in the next couple of months maybe, and everything's going to be just fine. But a whole other year would go by. So they've been out there for 2 years and no one has heard from them. And at this point, Charlie thinks to himself, okay, I have to go out and see if they're okay. And so he rounds up 4 other people from his town and he mounts an expedition to head back into the Nahanni Valley to go find his 2 brothers and find Robert Weir. Charlie and his search party eventually, after yet another long and arduous journey, they get into Nahanni Valley and they get onto the Flat River. And so they start making their way upstream along Flat River. So it must have been a very treacherous journey getting through the rapids of this river. And the whole time they're scanning the left and the right side, hoping to see some sign of life. They're looking for any indication that these 3 men are out here and just fine, but they didn't see any sign of them. And so they finally made their way all the way up to the very end of Flat River, or I should say the very beginning of Flat River, where it breaks off from a much larger river called the South Nahanni River. And once they turned onto the South Nahanni River, they began going downstream. And again, they're looking on either side for any sign of these 3 men. There's no sign of them. And then the river they're on takes a very sharp turn. It's actually called the Big Bend, and it's about a 45-degree turn. And as soon as you make that turn, it dumps you into this 10-mile stretch of river called Second Canyon. Now, along South Nahanni River, which is about 350 miles long, there are these 4 canyons that the water passes through. And they're labeled 4th Canyon, 3rd Canyon, 2nd Canyon, and 1st Canyon. And these canyons are massive. These sheer cliffs on either side of the river shoot up to 3,000 feet above the water, and in some parts the water is actually just as deep, thousands of feet deep. And Second Canyon is unique because the cliff faces are as sheer as you're going to get, and the cliff faces almost butt up exactly up against the water. So there's really very little shoreline on either side. So once you're in this 10-mile stretch, you're basically boxed in. You have thousands of feet of water below you. You have these massive cliffs on either side, and there's really nowhere to go. You need to get through this section of the river before you can effectively get onto the shoreline and take a break from being in your boat. And along these cliffs are these openings you see high up all over the cliffs on both sides that are openings to these massive cave systems inside of these thousands of feet tall cliffs. And because of how difficult it is to not only get to Nahanni Valley, but also to get up to these different cave openings, nobody's gone inside of them. We don't know what's inside of these caves, save for the few that are down low enough that people can explore. So as you're passing through Second Canyon, it's almost like you're being watched because there's all these openings, but you can't see into them, and you're just forced to go down this 10-mile stretch, and you can't really go anywhere, and whatever's watching you, it's watching you. As soon as Charlie and his search party party entered into Second Canyon, it would have immediately gotten darker, because that's another part of being in Second Canyon. These huge cliff walls of this canyon obscure the sunlight. And so they would have entered into this canyon, it would have gotten darker, and it's very windy inside of Second Canyon. So the winds would have picked up, so it's dark, very strange setting for them to be in, and they would have been looking on either side at these little strips of shoreline on either side, barely big enough for a boat to be. They would have been looking for any sign of life, but they didn't see anything. As they're making their way down this 10-mile stretch, as they're getting closer and closer to actually entering into First Canyon, which is the next canyon you would enter into, the sides of the river start to get slightly larger, where you could actually beach a boat. There's some trees, and on the left-hand side, right before exiting Second Canyon, they notice there is actually a tent perched within some trees. And so the search party naturally goes right over to the shoreline, they hop out, but as soon as they step foot on land and they have a clearer view of this tent and what's outside of it, they notice there is a body clearly lying on the ground outside of the tent. And so Charlie and the search party, they run over, and as soon as they're up close, they can tell this body is missing its head. And they see the clothes on this body are totally charred and burned, and whoever this was, they were reaching with their right arm when they died. And right outside of the reach of their right arm was a rifle that was propped up against a tree. And so they walk around this one body, and they go around towards the backside of the tent where the opening to this tent is, and they find another body, another very badly decomposed body, and it's positioned kind of halfway in the tent and halfway out of the tent. And there's a blanket kind of partially obscuring this person's body, and when they move the blanket, they see this body too is missing its head. So Charlie and the search party, they continue to search around the camp in hopes of finding the heads of these two people to try to figure out who they are, but they never find the heads. However, they do find some personal effects both in the pockets of these two bodies and then also inside the tent that would confirm these are Charlie's brothers. As for the third man that had been with them, Robert Weir, he was not at the campsite, and in fact he would never actually be found officially. However, a little ways down the river, another partial skeleton would be found several months later that was attributed to Robert. However, that was not 100% confirmed to be Robert. The only other interesting thing that was found at this campsite was a carving in a nearby tree, and it just said, "We have found a fine prospect," indicating that Charlie's brothers had found gold. But there was no gold either on them or in their camp or in the river nearby. Nothing. There was no gold. Charlie and his search party would leave the valley and get in touch with the mounted police, who would come out to the site where the brothers had been found. They would launch an investigation, and ultimately they would come to the conclusion that all three of these men, the two brothers and Robert, had starved to death, and then after they had perished, animals had taken them off, which is why Robert was found so far away and why the skulls were missing from the two brothers. Now, Charlie did not believe that. He believed they had been attacked by native tribes in the area, but the police were not buying that. They said this was a natural thing, this was an accident, and so that's that. When the story of these two decapitated men made the news, people went crazy about this. People were very divided about what they thought really happened. There was a percentage of people that believed that partial skeleton that was found, that was not Robert Weir. He had not died. He had murdered the two brothers, decapitated them, and then made off with their gold. The other percentage of people believed that all three men, the two brothers and Robert, had been attacked by a person, a group of people, an animal, a creature, something. There was some sort of attack, and that's why the two brothers were in those positions that indicated they had encountered something horrifying, with one brother reaching for the gun and the other appearing to have leapt from his bed before he ultimately died. But regardless of which side you fell on, pretty much everybody at the time who heard about the story became terrified of the Nahanni Valley. Specifically, they became terrified of that stretch in Second Canyon where the two brothers had been found. And so actually that stretch got renamed the Headless Valley, and from that point forward, that's all it was known as. And so even though there were obvious gold prospects in the Headless Valley and all along the South Nahanni River and the Flat River, people, after this story broke, were just not prepared to risk going in there and potentially becoming another victim. And so people kind of stayed away from Nahanni Valley. 8 years later, though, in 1913, a gold prospector named Martin Jorgensen Jorgensen decided, you know what, I'm not going to let some scary stories about some headless men and, ghosts and killers on the loose. I'm not going to let any of that get in the way of me taking gold out of Nahanni Valley. So all on his own, Martin makes the arduous trek inside of Nahanni Valley. He makes his way up Flat River, and he finally finds a spot about 70 miles upstream of where Headless Valley was, and he actually built a one-room cabin because he was going to stay there through the winter, and then the plan was he would meet up with his partners the following summer. And so right after he got there, he set up his sluices and he started mining for gold, and apparently he found a lot of it because he sent word back to his partners outside of the valley that he had made it rich. And so his partners were really excited to meet up with him the following summer and see how much he got because they planned on going back into the valley with him that summer. So that summer rolls around, his partners go to the meeting spot right outside the valley, but Martin doesn't show up. And so his partners, they stay outside at this meeting space for several days until finally, when he doesn't show up, they decide, we have to go in there and see if he is okay, because at this point he should have been here. There's no excuse. And so they end up going into the Nahanni Valley. They make their way up Flat River, and they go roughly to the area where they knew he was staying based on the message he had sent earlier. He had described where he was staying, and they actually found his cabin. Or I should say they found what was left of his cabin. His cabin had been completely torched, burned to the ground, and laying on the ground next to the burned out cabin was the burned out remains of another headless corpse. And this corpse belonged to Martin Jorgensen. The police did a thorough investigation, but they were never able to determine what actually killed him. The police did not connect Martin's death with the two McLeod brothers' deaths, even though they were all decapitated. They were in roughly the same area, and it happened within a few years of each other, and they looked very, very similar. Even though that all was true, the police said, nope, these are totally separate. Martin died for some reason, and then animals took parts of him away, and that's why his skull is missing. Martin's skull was never located, and the gold that Martin claimed to have struck it rich with was also not at the cabin, not on him. There was no gold anywhere in the vicinity. When Martin's death made the news, people went crazy, and despite the police assuring everyone that his death was not connected to the McLeod brothers' deaths, even though the police were saying that, the public didn't see it that way. It was just too easy to connect one decapitation with two other decapitations that have happened close together in a relatively short time frame, and so a lot of people assumed there must be a killer on the loose somewhere in Nahanni Valley. 7 years later, in 1921, the rumors of a killer on the loose were still alive and well when gold prospector John O'Brien and his partner decided, you know what, despite the rumors of this so-called killer or whatever's going on in the Nahanni Valley, let's go into the Nahanni Valley and try our hand. Let's try to get some gold. And so the two of them made their way into the valley, and they set up camp in Headless Valley, not far from where the McLeod brothers had been found decapitated. So they set up their camp, and they're there for a couple of days. They're doing well. They're finding gold. And then at some point, John tells his partner that he's going to go out and check all of their traps along the river, and he'll be back in about 8 or 9 days. And so his partner waits 8 or 9 days, and John doesn't come back. And a couple of days after that goes by, and now John's past due, and so the partner decides he has to go out looking for him. And so there was another gold prospector in the area, and so this partner contacted him, and the two of them went to the river and began walking upstream until they found John. And he had frozen to death, but it was very interesting the way he was positioned. He was sitting in front of this obviously previously lit campfire. He wasn't hunched over. He didn't look like he was in pain. He looked like he was just enjoying the fire. There was nothing on his face that indicated discomfort or pain or fear. He was even holding the matchbook in his hand. It was like he was just sitting there enjoying the fire when something caused him to suddenly freeze. In fact, witnesses would say John looked like he had been flash frozen, as if it had happened in a matter of seconds, because it didn't look like he had reacted properly to freezing to death. And the police, when they came out, they would say, this is odd. This is odd the way he's positioned. But ultimately, he died because he froze to death. And so there's no foul play here. And so no further investigation is needed. 5 years later, in 1926, a hunting party that included a young woman named Annie Lafferty was camping out along the Flat River inside of Headless Valley. And so that night, they're all kind of joking around the fire. And then at some point, they decide to all go to sleep. And then the next day, when everybody gets up, Annie is no longer in camp. And there's no sign of where she went. And so they begin by yelling out and walking around the immediate vicinity to see maybe if she stepped away for a minute, but Annie's just gone and no one knows where she went. And so the hunting party spends the rest of the day looking for Annie, but there's no sign of her. They ultimately leave the valley. They tell police. Police come out. There's this huge search, but Annie's never found. Several months later, a man named Charlie, who happened to have been out near Flat River, near this hunting party when they were out there, but Charlie himself was not in the hunting party. He didn't know Annie. He was just in the vicinity. He overheard someone talking about a member of that hunting party, specifically a woman, going missing. And when he heard that, he knew he had to tell police what he had seen that night out near Flat River. So he goes to police and he explains that that night when he knew there was this hunting party over there, he could hear them, he knew they were over there. He said at some point he went to bed and then he woke up when he heard the sound of rocks falling into the river in front of him. He was sleeping along the river's edge. So he sits up and he looks out across the river. It's totally dark, but there's some moonlight and he's kind of looking around wondering what's causing the sound, but he can't see it. And then he hears it again and he can tell it's off to his left. And these are not huge rocks. These are like medium to small size rocks, like rocks you could just pick up and throw. And so he's looking and all of a sudden he sees maybe a couple hundred yards away through some sparse trees, he sees a naked woman, a white naked woman running on all fours up this mountainside. And as she's running up the mountainside, her feet and her hands are knocking little rocks into the river down below. She's right on the edge of this cliff. And as she's running up this hill, she stops and she turns and he gets a good look at her face. And Charlie would say he was so taken aback by her face. It looked like she was possessed. There was something wrong with her face. And so Charlie instinctively ducked down and chose not to follow her, even though he knew anybody running naked anywhere in the wilds is doomed. But he felt like he could not go near this woman. There was something wrong with this woman. And so the police, they take this story down and they say, hey, you know, this is what Annie looked like. And Charlie would say, I think that's her. I think that matches her description. And so universally, it's believed this woman galloping up this hillside in the middle of the night naked was Annie. The police ultimately would not investigate Annie's disappearance any further because at the time Charlie was telling them this piece of information, she'd already been gone for months and the assumption was she was dead. 4 years later, in 1931, another gold prospector decides to try their luck in Headless Valley. A man named Phil Powers. He makes his way into the valley. He finds a spot off of Flat River. He builds a cabin. And then shortly thereafter, his cabin burns to the ground with him inside of it. Now, his skeleton was intact, but the strange thing about his death is based on the origin of the fire, which would have been on the roof. He should have had an opportunity to climb out of the cabin before it burned down, giving rise to the theory that he was actually dead before the fire started. However, the police said this was an accident caused by Phil doing something with the stovepipe that led to it catching on fire, and this was just all one big accident. But the vast majority of people that have followed along to this point with all of these strange deaths, they were just not buying it. 5 years later, in 1936, two more gold prospectors, William Epler and Joseph Mulholland, they entered the Headless Valley to try their luck, and shortly after arriving and getting set up, they went missing. A search party came out to look for them, and they found their cabin, and just like Phil Powers, it had burned to the ground, but William and Joseph were not in the ashes. They were not anywhere nearby. In fact, they were never found. No one has any idea what happened to them, and no one knows what caused the fire. 9 years later, in 1945, yet another gold prospector named Ernest Savard entered the Headless Valley to go looking for gold, and then when he did not leave the valley for an intended rendezvous with some of his partners went looking for him, and they would find him inside of his sleeping bag laying down, decapitated right along the Flat River inside of the Headless Valley. And so the police would come out, they would do an investigation, and they would call this an accident where, he starved to death or he died of hypothermia, and then after he was dead, animals must have come in and removed his skull, and that's why we can't find it. And so the police did not, at least not publicly, connect his death to all of the other decapitations in that small area. 1 year later, in 1946, another gold miner named John Patterson went into Headless Valley and he went missing. And so a search party went in looking looking for him, and John would never be found. But on one of the last nights that the search party was in the Headless Valley, they were camping out near Flat River, some native tribes people came into their camp and they warned them about some white figures that were walking around the valley that night. They're down near the river, they're out in the forest, they're kind of all around here, and so you really need to be careful. You don't want them to see you. And then these tribes people just left. And so the search party is absolutely horrified. They know about the rumors of this place. They're out here looking for someone that's gone missing in this place. And all night, all they hear are distant howls and screams that they hadn't heard in the previous nights. They're hearing these wailing sounds coming from all around them, like these things that are out there were intentionally trying to scare them to get them to leave. It felt like they were not supposed to be there. The next day, first thing when they got up and they left, the leader of that search party would say he just felt like the whole valley was totally sinister, and that constant wailing they heard the night before, he said he will never forget. From the mid-1940s onward, there have been far less strange incidents reported inside of Nahanni Valley, but one could attribute that to the fact that far less people have been going into Nahanni Valley ever since the 1940s. And in recent times, huge segments of the park have been permanently closed. The park has said the reason they're doing that is to protect that segment of the park, but other people have speculated that at least part of the reason why they're closing these segments, many of which are right near the Headless Valley, is because they're trying to protect people from getting anywhere near whatever it is that's lurking inside of that park. But regardless, it is still a fact that over the last century, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of people that have either gone missing or who have died under very mysterious circumstances inside of this valley, and the truth is, nobody knows why. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to your kid's birthday party and then ask them if they want to hit the piñata. And then after you get their blindfold on, replace the piñata with a beehive. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like this hat, like this flannel, and all sorts of stuff. There's mugs and stickers and sweatshirts. If you're interested in Mr. Ballen merchandise, go to shopmrballen.com. If you're interested in upcoming deals and promotions relative to the shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen.